In the winter of 1964, a wooden crate arrived at a ranch outside Salmon, Idaho. Inside were two brand-new revolvers, blued steel, 4-inch barrels, chambered for a cartridge the American public had never heard of. They were the first two ever built, and the man they were shipped to had about an hour before he left for the Arctic. Elmer Keith took them with him. He took a partial box of ammunition the factory had tucked in alongside, because nobody was selling that ammunition yet. He was going after polar bear. On that trip he shot 5 caribou with those two revolvers, at ranges running from 60 yards out past 400. Now, that was not a mistake. This cartridge always had 2 halves to it, and one of them was meant for exactly that kind of country. But the other half, the half that got the industry to say yes in the first place, was supposed to ride a patrolman's hip, a man who would carry it 8 hours a day on a leather belt, get in and out of a patrol car 100 times a shift, and most likely never fire it at anything but a paper target. That was the half that was going to change American law enforcement. And its first 2 guns opened their story on Arctic tundra. 60 years later, that is still roughly where you find it. In the deer woods, in the elk country, in a chest holster in bear country. Almost never on a duty belt. And the usual explanation for that is one word: recoil. The usual explanation is too small. Not wrong exactly, just far too small for a decision that took 13 years to play out. The real story involves a police load that developed a problem almost nobody talks about, a cartridge that arrived without something both of its rivals already had, and one man who, before he ever asked for the 41, had already helped build the gun that would beat it. Here is the first thing that has to be cleared up, and it is hiding inside the title of this video. The 41 Magnum was not designed to erase the .357 from the face of the earth. What its backers were trying to do was narrower and more reasonable. They were solving a specific complaint about the .357 that a lot of working lawmen had at the time. And that complaint was not really about the cartridge, it was about the bullets it was loaded with. In the early 1960s, if a police officer bought a box of factory .357 Magnum ammunition, what he mostly got was a plain lead bullet, moving fast. Expanding jacketed bullets, the kind of engineering that would eventually define modern defensive ammunition, were not yet a normal thing you could pick up at a counter. So the men who worked the roughest ground in America were looking at a menu with 2 items on it: a .38 caliber bullet they did not fully trust, or a .44 Magnum, out since '55, that most officers simply could not shoot well under pressure. So the idea forms: something in the middle, more authority than a .38, more control than a .44. On paper, that is one of the most sensible ideas in the history of American handguns, which is exactly why its struggle is worth understanding. The idea was never the problem. Now, what did they actually ask for? This part matters more than anything else in the story, and most retellings walk right past it. Bill Jordan was a former Marine, a Border Patrol agent, and one of the finest exhibition shooters this country ever produced. He had specific ideas about what a working officer needed and the standing to be listened to. What Jordan wanted was a .40 caliber bullet, about 200 grains, moving somewhere near 1,200 feet per second. But he wanted something else, and this is the part to hold on to. He wanted it in a medium frame revolver, light enough to carry all day, light enough for a fast draw. That was not a footnote. For Jordan, the gun size was half the specification. He was not asking for more power in the abstract. He was asking for more power in the same package a patrolman already wore. Elmer Keith agreed on the police side, then added a second layer, because Keith was first and always a hunter. Keith wanted 2 power levels in the same cartridge, a lead semi-wad cutter running around 1,100 feet per second for city work, and a jacketed load pushed up toward 1,400 or 1,500 for open country. 1 cartridge, 2 personalities, a mild one for the city and a hot one for the mountains. In 1963, at the National Rifle Association's annual meeting in Washington, Keith and Jordan went to work on the industry in person. Smith & Wesson, Colt, Ruger, Remington. And it says something about the standing Elmer Keith held in that world, that he walked out with verbal commitments from all of them. Smith and Wesson agreed to chamber the round in their large N frame, and agreed to look at a 5-shot version on the medium K frame. Colt thought it might fit the Python. Ruger was in with the Blackhawk. Remington promised the ammunition. That is the high water mark of this entire story. In one afternoon, 2 men got 4 of the biggest names in the American firearms industry to say yes. The brief on the table had 2 halves: a cartridge and a gun small enough to carry. Only one of those halves survived. And the first turn came from a decision that was completely correct. Jordan had envisioned a bullet of 400 thousandths of an inch. Keith suggested going up to 410 thousandths instead. His reason was safety, and it was a good one. There were old Colt revolvers out there chambered for the .41 long Colt, guns from the 1890s, built for black powder pressures. Make the new cartridge too close in size, and eventually somebody drops one into the wrong gun. Keith wanted that door closed. Remington agreed. So the bullet grew. 10 thousandths of an inch, about the thickness of 3 sheets of paper. Now, nobody can point to a memo saying that decision killed the compact revolver, but it appears to have narrowed the engineering margin for the small gun Jordan had imagined. A wider bullet meant a wider case, at serious pressure, and that means cylinder walls, a bigger cylinder, a bigger frame. What we know for certain is what happened next. Colt backed away from the Python idea, and Smith and Wesson did not pursue the 5-shot medium frame. What actually reached the market was the opposite of what Bill Jordan had asked for. In early 1964, Smith and Wesson shipped the Model 57, full-size N-frame, bull barrel, target sights, a velvet-lined wooden presentation case. It was a beautiful gun. It was a hunter's gun. It was the gun that went to the Arctic. Then in July, at the NRA convention in Los Angeles, they introduced the other one, the Model 58. No presentation case, no target sights, fixed rear notch cut into the frame, plain service grips. Smith and Wesson called it the .41 Military and Police. This was the police gun. This was the answer to the brief, and it weighed about 41 ounces. For comparison, the medium frame Model 19 in .357 with a 4-inch barrel runs about 36, 5 ounces. On paper, that sounds like an argument about nothing. Now put it on a belt, with a badge and a radio and handcuffs and spare ammunition, for a 10-hour shift, 5 days a week, for 20 years. Every officer who ever carried a duty gun understands that 5 ounces is not nothing. It is the difference between a tool you forget about and a tool you notice all day. And that is the shape of the whole problem. The police-oriented .41 arrived materially heavier than the refined medium-frame .357 system it needed to replace. The solution had grown until it began recreating part of the problem it was supposed to solve. Now, if the story ended there, it would be simple. And it is not simple, because departments did buy it. Amarillo, Texas issued the Model 58. So did San Antonio. The Nevada State Patrol carried them from 65 to 69, and several other departments around the country adopted them or authorized them. These were not skeptics who got talked into something. A lot of the men who carried a .41 on duty spent the rest of their lives insisting it was the best gun they ever wore. So the question is not why nobody wanted it. Plenty of people wanted it. The question is why it did not hold. And part of the answer sits in something almost never mentioned, which is that the mild load, the whole controllability half of the plan, developed a problem. Remington's police loading used a soft swaged lead bullet, and soft lead moving at that speed left lead deposits in barrels. For a police armorer maintaining dozens of guns, that is not an academic issue. That is cleaning time, inspection time, and a gun that gets progressively less accurate between attentions. So some agencies made the obvious call. They switched to the jacketed load. And the jacketed load recoiled like a completely different cartridge. Follow that, because it is the part that reframes the standard recoil explanation. An agency that stepped off the mild load did not step down to something gentler. There was nothing gentler to step down to. It stepped up. The two-tier plan was supposed to be a ladder inside one cartridge. In practice, the bottom rung developed a maintenance problem, and the only direction off it was up. Every time that happened, the controllability advantage the whole project was built on got narrower. There is more. The police load ran about 1,050 feet per second out of a long 8-inch target barrel. Out of a 4-inch duty gun, the barrel officers actually carried. It was closer to 900. So a department switching from a .38 Special was told it was buying a large step up in authority. What its officers got was noticeably more recoil in a heavier gun at velocities below the headline figures. And years later, when police interest cooled and hunting interest grew, Remington stopped making the mild load altogether. Think about what that means for an ordinary buyer standing at a gun counter. The .41 Magnum became a cartridge you could buy in exactly one flavor: loud. Which brings us to the thing that I think genuinely explains this cartridge, and it has almost nothing to do with ballistics. Ask yourself what the .357 Magnum actually was in 1964. Most people would say it was a cartridge. It was not. It was a staircase. Underneath the .357 sat the .38 Special. Same bullet diameter, same chambers. Shorter case, lower pressure, a fraction of the recoil, and cheap. A department could buy one revolver and get two entirely different guns out of it. Qualify the rookies on .38 Specials, run the range days on .38 Specials, buy them by the case because they cost almost nothing. Then load the duty rounds and go to work. Same sight picture, same trigger, same holster. The .44 Magnum had the same arrangement. The .44 Special sat underneath it, doing the same job for the same reason. And underneath the .41 Magnum? Nothing. No standardized shorter cartridge. No cheap practice round. No gentle rung for a nervous rookie, or an aging officer, or a shooter who just wanted a Saturday afternoon at a range without a headache. And here is the part most retellings skip entirely. Elmer Keith had already described that missing rung. In 1955, in his book Six Guns, 9 years before the Magnum ever shipped, Keith laid out the case for a .41 Special. He presented it as the natural counterpart to the .44 Special. A moderate, sensible, everyday .41 caliber round. The industry never standardized it. When the project finally moved in 1963, it went straight to Magnum, and the lower rung stayed on the floor. It is still not a standardized cartridge today. So the missing ladder is not something modern shooters invented in hindsight. The concept was on the record, in print, from the man who fathered the cartridge, almost a decade early. The .357 Magnum did not beat the .41 Magnum with ballistics. It beat it with a cheap little cartridge that had been sitting on dealers' shelves since 1902. That changes the comparison completely. And it gets sharper, or sadder, depending on how you feel about irony. Go back to 1955 for a moment. Bill Jordan, the same man who would stand up at that NRA meeting 8 years later, had a project of his own. At the time, a department that wanted a .357 was buying a big N-frame revolver. Heavy. Jordan thought that was backwards. He wanted .357 power in a medium-frame gun an average officer could actually live with. He pushed Smith & Wesson's president, Carl Hellstrom, hard on it. The company spent about a year on stronger steels and heat treatment to make a K-frame survive Magnum pressures. The result was the Combat Magnum. The first one off the line was presented to Bill Jordan personally, in November of 1955. 2 years later it got a number, Model 19. That gun went on to become the most widely carried service revolver in American law enforcement. So look at what Jordan walked into in 1963. He was not competing against a dusty 1930s concept. He was competing against a refined, proven, medium-frame service revolver that fit a working officer's hand and belt. He was competing against his own best work. That is the moment the whole story turns. The .41 was never fighting a cartridge. It was fighting a finished product with a satisfied customer base and a cheap practice round. And then the incumbent kept getting better. In 1970, Smith & Wesson released the Model 66, a stainless steel medium-frame .357, for a department dealing with rain, sweat, salt air, and officers who do not clean their guns. Stainless steel was not a luxury. It was a maintenance budget. Then in 1974 came the Model 13, a fixed-sight, medium-frame, plain .357 military and police revolver, built because a state police agency asked for exactly that. Read that description again. A fixed-sight, medium-frame, no-frills service Magnum, made to order for a police department. That is very nearly the gun Bill Jordan asked for in 1963. Smith & Wesson eventually built it. They just built it in .357. Meanwhile, the .41 waited. Its stainless end frame did not arrive until 1986, by which point American police departments were already walking away from revolvers entirely. The lightweight, thin-barreled .41 that Keith predicted at the very beginning finally showed up in 1998, and the Model 58, the actual police gun, the one built to answer the brief, was discontinued in 1977. So here is the shape of it. Every improvement that made a service revolver easier for a department to own arrived on the .357 side first. Now, before this turns into a defense of a cartridge, it deserves a real counterargument, because there is a strong one. The logic of the middle ground goes, the .357 is not enough, the .44 is too much, therefore the .41 is perfect. But a technical midpoint only matters if real demand actually sits at that midpoint. And there is good reason to think it did not. Remember why the project started. The complaint was not about the .357 cartridge. It was about the bullets available for it in 1962. Then, through the late 60s and into the 70s, jacketed expanding bullets became ordinary. Ammunition makers got serious about defensive projectiles. Testing got more rigorous. The specific weakness the .41 Magnum was built to fix was substantially addressed inside the incumbent cartridge, while the .41 was still trying to find a footing. That is not a small thing. It may be the most honest explanation of all. And at the other end, the people who wanted maximum power already had a .44 Magnum with an identity so strong it did not need explaining to anybody. Which gives you a sentence worth sitting with. The people who needed less already had enough. The people who wanted more already wanted the most. The .41 may have solved a genuine performance gap, while sitting in a market gap much narrower than the drawing suggested. There is one more piece, and this one is interpretation rather than documented fact, so treat it that way. Elmer Keith reportedly wanted to call it the .41 Police. Remington named it the .41 Magnum instead. And you can watch Smith & Wesson trying to manage that tension in their own advertising. They called the Model 58 the .41 M&P. They referred to the mild round as the city load, and saved the word Magnum for the hot jacketed round, meant for open country. That is a company aware it was selling restraint to cautious municipal buyers. Whether the Magnum name actually cost the project adoption, nobody can prove. But the positioning and the product were pulling in different directions, and that rarely helps. So, add it up. The problem was real, the concept was right, but the gun that shipped was bigger than the brief. The mild load developed a flaw that pushed users toward the hot one, and there was never a cheap bottom rung to practice with. Meanwhile, the incumbent had already been perfected, partly by one of the .41's own architects, and kept receiving every upgrade first. Not one villain, not one mistake. A series of reasonable decisions that added up to a product nobody could easily say yes to. Nobody buried the .41 Magnum. American shooters were not foolish, and police departments were not stubborn. Engineering merit and adoptability are two completely different things. A cartridge can win every argument on a ballistics chart and still lose in a supply room, a training budget, and a leather holster. The most dangerous competitor to a better idea is almost never a better idea. It is an older system that already works well enough, that everybody already knows, and that already has a cheap version. Which brings this back to a crate in Idaho. Those first two revolvers went straight from the shipping box to the Arctic, and in a way, the .41 Magnum never came home from that trip. It has spent 60 years in the deer woods and the elk country, in silhouette matches and chest holsters in bear country, which was always one half of the original idea. It is also the one place where nobody had to change a whole system to say yes to it. No procurement committee, no qualification course, no armorer, no city council. Out there, a hunter just had to like it. That was the entire adoption process. And enough of them did that a cartridge everybody keeps calling a failure has now outlived most of the men who wrote its obituary. If there is one thing I take away from all of this, it is that a good idea has to be easy to say yes to, and almost nobody designs for that. If you are the kind of shooter who cares less about which cartridge wins the chart and more about why some good guns disappear and some ordinary ones last 50 years, this channel is built for you. Subscribe and stay with us. And here is the honest question, because it has two reasonable sides. If you were running a department in 1965, would you have issued the best cartridge you could find, or the best one your weakest shooter could master? Because those were not the same answer. They almost never are.